Hello, and welcome to the Rhode Island Bumblebee ID Guide, brought to you through the Rhode Island Pollinator Atlas as part of the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, Division of Fish and Wildlife. So the Rhode Island Pollinator Atlas is a project funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as an effort to comprehensively inventory our insect pollinators here in Rhode Island. I'm the lead on this project. My name is Katie Burns, and my supervisor is Jennifer Brooks, who's the volunteer program coordinator at DEM and bat biologist. So today we're just going to take you through the basics of Bumblebee ID in general, and then also teach you how to ID the species that you can most commonly find here in Rhode Island. So without further ado, let's learn more about our bumblebees. Okay. So what does a bumblebee look like in general? How do we recognize them? So bumblebees have large, robust bodies and are very, very furry. You've probably seen them buzzing around in your garden or maybe out on hikes or walks. The color patterns that they have on their body are made by their hairs, as opposed to being directly on their exoskeletons, just kind of like their skin, unlike a lot of other insects. They also carry their pollen in distinct pollen baskets, or at least the females do. So they kind of look like they have thick thighs when they're carrying a lot of pollen, which is another way to know that it's a bumblebee. So let's just go through some basic bee anatomy so we can familiarize ourselves with some of the features of bumblebees, because we'll be talking a lot about them later when we're learning how to identify bees to species. So the bumblebee is made up of three main parts. They have their head with two antennae. They have their midsection, which is called a thorax. And they have an abdomen that is made up of several segments called terga. So female bumblebees have 6 of these tergal segments, and male bumblebees have 7, which we'll go into a little bit later when we're distinguishing female bees from male bees. Now, of course, it's all very well and good to look at this very tidy diagram and be able to identify these features, which is why I've also included a picture of the same species of bumblebee, but a real picture. And again, you can see the head, thorax, abdomen, and antenna, but here on a real bumblebee. But as I was just saying, bumblebees don't always behave or look the same as neat and tidy diagrams. And more often than not, when you see a bumblebee out in the wild, it's foraging on a flower and not laid out really nicely in a scientific diagram. But here you can still see same type of bee foraging on a willow. And here is, again, the antenna, the head, the thorax, that midsection, abdomen, and those tergal segments, just from the side here. So when we're identifying bumblebees, we want to ask 3 main questions. The first is it a bumblebee? Second, is it a male or a female, or is it a queen or a worker? And finally, what species of bee is it? So we'll start off with what does a bumblebee look like compared to other insects you might see out there that look similar? So we have a little quiz here, to be or not to be. Believe it or not, only one of these pictures is of an actual bumblebee, despite them all looking very, very similar. And it's this one, and I'm going to explain why. So these other 2 are actually flies, though they are very well disguised as a bumblebee. This is called Batesian mimicry. It's when creatures or other organisms look like something that maybe a predator wouldn't want to eat. So there's a great advantage for a fly to look like a bee, because hopefully things that want to eat that fly will think it has a stinger and not try and eat it. So it's nice to look like a bee. But there are some good ways that you can tell these species apart, even though they have these very similar coloration patterns. So first, you can look at the antenna. Flies have short, straight antenna, while bumblebees have long, elbowed antenna. So if you see something that looks like a bumblebee, but it doesn't really seem to have antenna or really short antenna, it's probably a fly. Bumblebees also have 2 pairs of wings, like their other hymenopteran cousins, like wasps and other bee species, while flies actually only have 2 wings. So 2 wings as opposed to 4 wings on a bumblebee. Bumblebees also carry pollen in these very distinct pollen baskets. So these nice thick thighs that I was mentioning before, those nice big pollen loads. This is because they need to collect pollen to bring back to their colonies to feed other workers and their developing larvae. Flies don't live in colonies, they live solo, so they don't need to collect pollen to bring back to their families. These insects also fly very differently from each other. So flies are much better flyers than bumblebees. They have very quick, erratic flight patterns. They move really fast, while a bumblebee has a much slower, bouncier flight, almost like follow the bouncing ball when you're doing a sing-along. Flies also have forward-facing eyes as opposed to bumblebees, which have their eyes on the side of their head, kind of like little aliens. So this is a picture of a robber fly actually eating a bee, not a bumblebee, another species of bee. But I like this picture because it really shows that difference in their facial structures. You can see the robber fly, which is holding that smaller bee, has those forward-facing eyes, while the bee has eyes on the side of its head. And there are other lookalikes out there as well. So these are some wasp and bee lookalikes that may be confusing if you're looking for bumblebees. So first we have our wasps. So wasps, unlike bumblebees, are not very hairy. They might have some bristles on them, a few hairs, as opposed to bumblebees, which are covered in hair. They also have very narrow bodies with a very distinct waist, as opposed to our very chubby bumblebees. They kind of look like villains in cat suits. They also have their color patterns on their exoskeleton directly, so right on the surface of their bodies, as opposed to their hairs making their color patterns. They also don't carry pollen in distinct loads, those distinct pollen baskets like a bumblebee would. There might be pollen on their bodies because they also visit flowers, but they're not going to carry them in those distinct pollen loads. Then we have our honeybees, which are probably the most recognizable bee out there, since we are all very familiar with beekeepers and honey, and they're very popular in the media. So honeybees are much smaller and slenderer than a bumblebee. They have sort of a torpedo shape as opposed to a very round, chubby shape. They also have the majority of their color patterns on their exoskeleton, similar to a wasp. Again, as opposed to bumblebees, which have coloration patterns on their hairs themselves. However, like bumblebees, they also carry pollen in distinct pollen baskets, those round pollen loads. So if you see a bee carrying a round pollen load, you'll want to look at these other features, such as the shape of the bee and its size and how its coloration is marked, whether on the hairs or the exoskeleton, to see if you're looking at a honeybee or a bumblebee. There are also some flies out there that are also using Batesian mimicry to look like honeybees. So don't get those confused with bumblebees either. So then we have a solitary bee species, the buffle-headed mason bee, that sometimes can be confused with bumblebees because their coloration is pretty similar. So unlike bumblebees, which live in colonies with workers and a queen, these are solitary bees, so a single female that takes care of her babies all by herself. Instead of living in underground burrows or in grass piles or leaf piles like a bumblebee would, these are cavity nesters, so they live in hollow stems. So if you see a bee that kind of looks like a bumblebee coming out of like a hollow stem, it's probably not a bumblebee. They, like bumblebees, have a pretty furry body with nice pale hairs. However, they're much, much smaller than a bumblebee. So here you can see that big picture has a buffle-headed mason bee visiting a blueberry flower. And then below you can see a bumblebee visiting the same type of flower. And that's a nice size comparison. The bumblebee is much bigger than the buffle-headed mason bee. And these bees, the buffle-headed mason bee, carry their pollen on the underside of their abdomen, which is that large bottom segment, instead of on their legs like a bumblebee would. So another thing to look for when you're trying to tell them apart. Then we have our eastern carpenter bee. So eastern carpenter bees are about the same size as a bumblebee queen. So they're very commonly misidentified. However, one of the big things to look for is that carpenter bees have a very shiny abdomen. So a bumblebee is completely covered in fur, furry all over. While the carpenter bee is going to have a naked abdomen, very shiny, which you can see in this picture. The males also have this white patch on their face and have very large greenish eyes. So if you see something that kind of looks like a bumblebee, but it has that very distinct shiny white patch on its face, you know that it's a carpenter bee. And again, they don't carry their pollen in distinct pollen loads. Again, you might see pollen on their bodies because they visit flowers, but they don't carry it in those balls on their legs like a honeybee or a bumblebee would. Okay, so now we know how to distinguish a bumblebee from some of the other insects that you might get it confused with when you're out in the field. So next, we need to ask the question, is it a male or a female bumblebee? So here we have diagrams of both a female and a male bumblebee. The main difference between these two, and one of the most fun ones, if you're interested in catching bees and looking at them up close, is that males don't have a stinger. So this is really nice for me as an educator to be able to catch male bees and be able to hold them in my hand and show them to people because it's a really nice experience to get people up close and personal with bees. However, you never want to do that unless you're absolutely sure that you have a male. But the reason that males don't have stingers is because the stinger is evolved from an egg-laying piece of anatomy way back in an ancient wasp ancestor of the bee. So for any of those wasps or bees, there's always that difference of females having a stinger and males not, because males never laid eggs. So other things to look for to make sure that you have a male versus a female or female versus a male is the length of the antenna. So female bees have, or bumblebees have 12 segments to their antenna, while males have 13. So they have antennae that look a little bit longer because they are. They also have longer bodies than the females. They have 7 tergal segments as opposed to 6. Many of them also have larger eyes because they have to scope out females to mate with. They also don't collect pollen, so they're not often grooming pollen off of their bodies. So they might appear a little disheveled, not as neatly groomed as a female would. And then, as I just said, because they don't collect pollen, they don't have those distinct pollen loads on the sides of their legs because they don't collect it. So in terms of the pollen collection, this is actually a really reliable thing to look for when you're determining whether it's a male or a female bumblebee. So female bumblebees have thick, shiny hind legs with a long fringe of curved hairs called scopa. And this is where they carry their pollen. You might also see them having a pollen mass on that pollen basket. So because males don't collect pollen, they have a much skinnier leg that's just covered in tiny little bristles, and you'll never see them with a pollen load. So again, that thick, triangular, shiny leg fringed by long hairs as opposed to a skinny, bristly leg. And then, of course, if you see a pollen load, you know you have a female. Another thing to look for is the face of the bumblebee. So here in Rhode Island, at least, most of our Rhode Island species males have yellow faces, or as I refer to them as little mustachioed gentlemen. So you can see in these pictures, all of these bees have very yellow faces, like little mustaches. So if you see that, then you can be pretty sure that you have a male as well. There's also this process called getting your eye in. So you might be hearing me talk about all this and you're like, Katie, how on earth am I going to be able to tell if it has, you know, a slightly longer body or slightly longer antenna or slightly, you know, skinnier legs? And if you spend enough time out there looking at bees and really starting to notice those differences, you really will get your eye in eventually and be able to tell even from far away, ooh, that looks like it might have a little bit longer antenna. And I think that's probably a male. So be patient with yourself. Bumblebee ID takes time, but eventually you will get your eye in. And you can kind of even start to see it with this patch of females over here versus this patch of males. Starting to see those longer antenna, longer body segments, and maybe more yellow on the face. So you may also want to be able to tell if it's a queen or a worker. And the main difference here is size. So queen bumblebees are usually around an inch long, while workers are about half an inch long, so about half the size. You can see that size comparison in this picture here. You can also sometimes tell what bees you're seeing just by the time of year that you're seeing them. So in the early spring, that's when queens start to emerge from hibernation. So you're going to be seeing mostly queens going out and nest searching so they can start their colonies. By midsummer, they'll have produced a lot of workers to help them collect food and clean their colonies. So you'll see mostly workers throughout the summer. And then in the late summer and early fall, that's when new queens start to emerge. And that's also when males start to emerge so that they can start mating before the new queens go into hibernation and the cycle starts all over. You can also notice differences in behavior. So both will be visiting flowers, obviously, to be drinking nectar, collecting pollen. However, queens also will sometimes be observed doing nest searching behaviors. So this is usually in the early spring. You might see queen bees hovering over bunch grasses or maybe near the edges of hedgerows or dirt mounds or something like that. And they're just looking for a good place to start their colony. Okay, so now we know how to tell whether a bee is a bumblebee or not. We can tell if it's a male or a female or a queen or a worker. So now we can get into the nitty gritty of what species of bee is it. So here in Rhode Island, we have 12 historic bumblebee species that used to be able to be found here. Now we can only see about half. So the bees that I have listed here are bees that haven't been seen here in the last decade or so. So Bombus affinis, which is a pretty famous bee, that's the rusty patch bumblebee, sort of the poster child for bumblebee conservation. Then we have Bombus citrinus, Bombus pennsylvanicus, Bombus ternarius, and Bombus terricola. So some of these bees are still common in other parts of New England, and some of these bees are in decline in general. So we're not going to go into the nitty gritty of their species identification because it's very unlikely that you'll see them in Rhode Island. But if you're interested in learning more and learning how to identify these species, especially if you're going to other parts of New England where they might be more common, I highly recommend Bumblebees of the Eastern United States, which is a free resource that you can find online. And it's an amazing identification guide for these species. So again, Bumblebees of the Eastern United States. But here are the bees that you can find right here in Rhode Island. So I've divided them into 3 different groups to help us identify them. So first we have our more than 50% black group. So when I'm talking about more than 50% black, I mean on the abdomen. Again, that large bottom segment. We have our 50% black group, and then we have our less than 50% black group. So in the more than 50% black group, we have Bombus impatiens, Bombus bimaculatus, and Bombus griseoculus or griseocolus, whatever you prefer. In the 50% black group, we have the Bombus vagans, Bombus perplexus, Bombus sandersonii or sandersoni. And then in the less than 50% black group, we have Bombus oricomus and Bombus fervidus. And we're going to go over each of these groups in detail. So first we have the more than 50% black group. So this group also happens to be the most common group that you will see here in Rhode Island. These are all very common bee species. You'll definitely see them all throughout the summer. In terms of telling them apart, we're going to go through each individually, but just to keep in mind as you're identifying these bees for ID tips, is first to make sure that you're always distinguishing between black hairs and no hairs. So on a bumblebee, their exoskeleton is black. So sometimes if a bee has been very busy or is maybe a little older, those hairs will start to rub off and you'll start to see that black exoskeleton underneath. So when we're talking about features such as black spots or black on the abdomen, it's really important that you make sure you're looking for hairs versus just seeing the exoskeleton poking from beneath. Also, because a lot of these bees do have some similar features, it's really important that you look at multiple features. Bees are like people. They don't stick to one way of being. And so you might see some species that look slightly different from each other, even within a species, because they might be older, they might have slight coloration differences. So it's really important to look at those multiple features if you're getting confused. Okay, so we'll start with our most common species, the common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. So this is a bee you will see everywhere during the summer, all through New England, and right here in Rhode Island. So they are distinctive in that they only have one band of yellow on their abdomen. So yellow only on that first turga. And from now on, I'm going to refer to the turga as T. So yellow on T1, on turga 1. And it's often in this nice bowed W shape. You can kind of see, especially in that picture to the top right, those sort of humps in that stripe. And then they have black on T2 to T6, so the majority of their abdomen. So they look like they have this nice big velvety black tail. They don't have a very distinct spot on their thorax. It looks mostly yellow. You can mostly see that with the top left picture and bottom right picture. Like I said, sometimes bees can get a little worn. So you can see in that top right picture, a little more black on that thorax, but that's because that bee has been rubbed off a little bit. So they look almost like they're balding instead of having a very distinct spot, just very yellow with sort of a black shadow as opposed to a distinct spot. They will also occasionally have some lemon yellow hairs on the top of their head and on their abdomen. So you can see in that bottom right photo, you can see some lemon yellow hairs on the abdomen there. Apologies for the typo. The abdomen, not the thorax. And then in terms of telling the males apart, the males look very similar to the females. They just have those distinctive male traits that we've discussed and that yellow face. Okay, our next bee that we're going to look at is the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus griseoculus or griseocolus, however you want to say it. So these bees also have yellow on T1, but they also have a patch of yellow in the middle of their second turtle segment, so T2. And this patch will have a rusty aura to it, almost looking brownish or orange, and is usually in sort of a half moon shape. And then from T3 to T6, it's all black. So majority of their abdomen is black. These bees, unlike Bombus impatiens, the common eastern that we just looked at, have a very distinct black spot in the middle of their thorax. It's very small and dense, but very distinct. You can especially see that in the top right photo. They also have very short cropped hair, kind of like they just got a buzz cut, and usually have no yellow or very little yellow on the top of their head. Usually their face and head look all black. And the males, again, look very similar to the females, though the males do tend to have very large eyes in comparison to some of the other males that you might see out and about. So if you see that short cropped hair, large eyes, and those features that look similar to the female, it's probably a male griseoculus. Then we have our Bimaculatus, our two-spotted bumblebee. These bees are super common, especially in early spring. They're one of the first bees that you'll see come out. They also have yellow on T1. And like griseoculus, they also have yellow in the middle of their T2 segment. However, they don't have that rusty aura. So it's going to be a very yellow spot. And it will also be in that little W shape. So almost like a miniature W as opposed to Bombus impatiens, which you can especially see in that top left photo. However, as you can see in the top right photo, the yellow spot can sometimes be very faint. So this is where it's important to look at multiple features. So these bees have a very distinct black spot in the middle of their thorax. It tends to be bigger than griseoculus and distinctive when you're comparing impatiens and Bimaculatus. So if you see a bee and you're like, I don't know if it really has that T2 W spot, but you see it has that nice black spot on its thorax, then you know that you have Bimaculatus as opposed to something like impatiens. They also tend to have long, shaggy hair and also usually have a little bit of yellow on the top of their head, are some other features you can look for. And the males, so gets a little divergent here. So some of the males of Bimaculatus look just like the females, but again, with those distinctive male traits and yellow face. However, some of the males have very different markings than the females. This sort of striping on the abdomen. So I have a picture of it here so you can see what it looks like. So some extra stripes towards the bottom of the abdomen. So if you see that sort of patchwork yellow in addition to the other bimaculatus traits and male traits, you know that you have a male bimaculatus. Okay, so moving on from our most common species, we're going to move to our less common species. And these species are a little harder to tell apart very reliably. So all of these species belong to a subgenus called Pyrobombus. And often, if you're familiar with iNaturalist and like to submit any sort of wildlife sightings to that site, it's very common to just submit any of these species as Pyrobombus because it's hard to tell them apart without using a microscope. There are some very distinctive identification methods you can use, but you need to use a microscope to use them because they involve ratios of length of the face versus other features on the body. So if you're just looking at these in the field, it's not quite as reliable to tell these species apart. However, we're still going to go through each of them because there are some very reliable features on some of these species that if you see them, you can say, okay, I know what I have here. So let's get into it. So we'll start with Bombus vagans. This is the half-black bumblebee, aptly named because their abdomen is half black. They have yellow on T1 and T2. Unlike the other species that we saw before that have just maybe a patch of yellow on that T2, the entire T2 segment is going to be yellow, as you can see in these pictures. So very distinctly striped yellow, and then black from T3 to T6. These bees have a black spot in the middle of their thorax. They also have a pretty long black face, which you can see in that bottom right picture. They tend to be a pretty small bee and tend to have very lemon yellow hair. And the males look very similar to the females, but with those distinctive male traits and yellow face. So now we have Sanderson's bumblebee, Bombus sandersoni. So this bee was actually not thought to be a historic species until very, very recently. We thought we only had vagans and perplexus here in Rhode Island, and it wasn't until members of the Stephen Alm lab, Dr. Stephen Alm's lab at URI, looked at some of their historic species and also some more recently caught specimens that they were able to determine that, yes, it is a historic species, it is present here. And this goes back to what I was saying, how it can be very hard to distinguish Sandersoni, perplexus, and vagans from each other, and why it's important to investigate collections using a microscope as well to look at those very distinctive traits that you can only see under a microscope. So now that we know that we have this bee here, we can begin to look at the features to identify it. So it's important to know, though, that it is pretty rare and pretty hard to ID because it looks very similar to especially vagans. So like vagans, it has yellow on T1 and T2 and black on T3 through T6. Its tail can be all black, or it might also have a little bit of yellow or white on the tail. So that's a good way to tell that it's not vagans. They also have a black spot in the middle of their thorax. However, sometimes the spot is so large that it extends to an entire band between its wings, as you can see in that top left photo. However, sometimes the spot is also really, really small and almost impossible to see, in which case you might confuse it with a perplexus, which we're going to go over next. It has a roundish face that's all black, sometimes with a few yellow hairs, and it's even smaller than Bombus vagans. So a good way to tell if it absolutely is Sandersoni as opposed to vagans is if it has those two yellow stripes and a black band between its wings. So the vagans won't ever have a really distinctive black band between its wings. It'll only have that spot. So if you see a black band and two yellow stripes in addition to these other identifiers, then you know you have Bombus sandersoni. And then the males, again, look very similar to the females. Then finally, the third bee out of this very confusing subgenus is the confusing bumblebee, Bombus perplexus. So Bombus perplexus also has yellow on T1 and T2. However, sometimes it will also have yellow on T3. It usually has black from T3 to T6 unless that T3 is yellow. And sometimes, like Sandersoni, it might have white on the tail. It often has yellow hairs on both the face and the top of the head, and very few black hairs on the thorax. So there isn't really a distinct spot, as you can see from these photos, just a very tiny, tiny dot. This is a really good way to tell it apart from vagans, but like I said, Sandersoni sometimes can have a very difficult to distinguish spot. So it's important to look at other features as well. These bees tend to have pretty long hair that appears a little bit more brownish as opposed to the others, which have more lemon yellow hair. So in terms of being able to tell if it definitely is perplexus or not, if the bee has yellow on T3, then you know that it's perplexus, because Sandersoni or vagans, they won't have that. You can also look at the sides of the thorax, and I'm going to show you pictures of this in a moment, to see if they have black armpits or yellow armpits or wing pits, I suppose. If they have black on the sides of the thorax, then you can be pretty sure that it's Bombus perplexus, because both vagans and Sandersoni have yellow on the sides. However, it's not always reliable, as I'm going to go into in a second. And again, the males look very similar to the females. So this is what I was saying with sides of the thorax, looking at those wing pits. So for both Bombus Sandersoni and Bombus vagans, they have yellow directly underneath their wings. So they kind of have those yellow armpits. While Bombus perplexus can often have black wing pits, as you can see here. However, not always. Sometimes perplexus will also have yellow on the wing pits. However, even if you see it with yellow on the wing pits, if it has yellow on that T3 segment, then you also can know it's perplexus. This is why they call it the perplexing bumblebee. So just final note on this fairly confusing trio. Just keep in mind, they're very difficult to tell apart. Don't beat yourself up if you're not able to tell them apart right away. Most of the time, as I said before, if you are submitting any observations of these bees to iNaturalist, just refer to them as subgenus Pyrobombus, and that is a very respectable way to identify these bees, because they can be very hard to tell apart. If you are looking at other features, you can most reliably put them into these boxes of Bombus vagans Sandersoni and Bombus perplexus. Bombus perplexus is much easier to tell apart from the other two bees than Bombus vagans and Sandersoni are from each other. So that's my note on all of those. But as I said and went over with you guys, there are some distinctive features that you can look for, so you can make sure that you have the bee that you think you have. Okay, moving on to our final group. So this is the less than 50% black on the abdomen group, and neither of these are a very common species. Bombus fervidus is a bee that you can pretty reliably find throughout Rhode Island, though, like I said, they're not very common. So if you find one, it's kind of like, I don't know, finding a pot of gold, but you can find them if you look hard enough. Bombus oricomus, on the other hand, is actually not a historic species in Rhode Island and was only very recently discovered here. So in August 2021, this bee was discovered here in Rhode Island. We suspect that it came over from Connecticut, reflecting a potential range shift. It hasn't been seen since, so it would be very exciting if someone found it, because that would maybe indicate that it is taking up residence here in Rhode Island. So very uncommon, very unlikely that you're going to see it, but I'll still go over the identification, because if you do see it, absolutely let me know. I want to know. That's very good information for us entomologists to have. So Bombus fervidus, the golden northern bumblebee, is also my favorite bumblebee. They're a really beautiful bee. They're very, very yellow, so very easy to tell apart from all of the other bees you might see here in Rhode Island. They're pretty rare and uncommon. though, you know, it can sometimes be hard to tell if something's actually rare or maybe they just have smaller colonies, so they're just a little bit more uncommon. Either way, they're a little hard to find. They have yellow on T1 to T4, so like I said, a very yellow bee, and black on T5 and T6, so just a very small black tail. They have a nice long face with black hairs on it, so a nice long black face, and they have a very distinctive band between their wings that can be quite narrow sometimes. And they're a very long bee, so the impression that you get of it when you see it out in foraging and out in the wild is that it's like a very long yellow bee. It's kind of like a banana bee. But because it's so long, it can sometimes be a little hard to tell apart males and females, because usually when you're looking between males and females, you're looking for a slightly longer body on the males. However, we have all of these other nice features like that we went over before, such as the antenna length or the shape of the leg that can help you tell apart the male and the females within the species. And finally, we come to Bombus oricomis, the black and gold bumblebee, our newcomer here in Rhode Island. So this bee has yellow bands on the thorax, so one towards the top of the thorax and then usually a much smaller one towards the bottom. It has yellow on T2 and T3. So T1 tends to be pretty black, but maybe some yellow hairs intermixed. And then the rest of the abdomen, T4 through T6, is black. This bee tends to have some yellow on the top of the head, but then a black face and very short hair. So these bees, the males of this species have pretty large eyes, which is a good way to tell them apart. It's a little hard to tell in this diagram, but you can see on that T1 segment, there is some black there. So they do have pretty similar markings to that of the females. Okay. So, bit of a whirlwind, but those are our Rhode Island bumblebee species that we have here, both historic species and a newcomer. If you're interested in looking at other resources for identifying these bees and going into even more detail, again, check out the Bumblebees of the Eastern United States, which is available for free online. If you want a book, Bumblebees of North America, an identification guide is also an excellent resource that you can pick up at your bookstore. I've mentioned iNaturalist a few times during this talk, which is an online community of naturalists who can actually help you identify your bees. So when you submit your sightings, your wildlife sightings to iNaturalist, they become part of community science data. So this is a great way for us to be able to track species across Rhode Island and then across other regions of the world. And the nice thing about it is when you upload your species, you don't even have to know what it is. You can maybe just know it's a bumblebee, upload a picture of it, and then someone else, an expert in the field, will come along, look at it, and be able to identify it for you. So it's a great way to practice ID. So you can be like, oh, I think it's Griseoculus. I'll post it and see if some of these experts agree. Bumblebee Watch is also an excellent community science initiative that's monitoring bumblebees in North America. They also will check your species for you, and you'll also be contributing to community science data, which is always a wonderful endeavor. We love community science. Anyone can be a scientist. All you have to do is get out there and observe the world around you. And just remember, identifying bees takes a lot of practice. That getting your eye in process that I was telling you about, it takes time. So the important thing is that you're just getting out there, you're looking at bees, maybe catching them in a net if you're brave, and taking a closer look at them, maybe just taking pictures of them or videos, and just generally getting to know your buzzing neighbors is the best thing to do if you want to work on these ID skills. Also, if you're really interested in looking at bumblebees and identifying them, we would love it if you joined the Rhode Island Bumblebee Survey, or RIBS as we refer to it. This is a community science effort to assess the status and distribution of Rhode Island's bumblebees. It's part of the Rhode Island Pollinator Atlas. I'm the lead on this project. We are starting our first official season this year, so spring 2023. However, it will be open to volunteers again in 2024. We already have our volunteers for this year, but we would love it if you joined us next year and followed along with us on social media so you can see some of the cool things that we're finding. Thank you so much for all of your attention. If you have any questions or require clarification on anything I've talked about today, please email your questions to me. My contact info is right here. And I hope you have a wonderful day and have fun out there catching and observing bumblebees.